The field is quiet. You can hear them across the mud before you can see them clearly. Tens of thousands of men in armor, and the sound they make is like a slow tide of iron, the creak of leather straps, the knock of steel plate shifting against steel plate, the occasional snort of a war horse smelling the damp earth. The smell of the French camp drifted over to the English lines all night. Cooking fires, wine, the sound of laughter. They were celebrating before it had even started. You have been marching for 17 days. You have eaten almost nothing. Your legs are mud to the knee. The man next to you hasn't slept in 2 days and is still recovering from an intestinal sickness so severe that 2 weeks ago he couldn't walk. Some of the men around you have cut away the back of their breeches entirely because the dysentery never fully stopped. Across the field, in the grey October light of a French morning, 25,000 men are looking at you. You are 6,000. What happens next should not be possible. What happens next will be studied for 600 years, and none of the studying will ever fully explain the thing that actually matters. Not the arrows, not the mud, not the tactics. What matters is this: why do men stand? Not when they think they'll win, when they know they might not. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to the Clash of Ancients. We cover history's most brutal, most decisive, and most misunderstood battles in the depth they deserve. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And I want to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, your country, anything in the comments below. We have viewers watching from every corner of the world, and I genuinely love seeing it. Now, back to that field. Here is what most people think they know about Agincourt. English longbowmen defeated a much larger French army. Henry V gave a great speech. Shakespeare wrote a play about it. The end. That version is not wrong. It is just so incomplete that it is almost useless, because it skips the part where this victory had no right to happen, where every military advantage belonged to the other side, where the English army had already been broken before the battle even began, and where the man leading it did something in the middle of his greatest triumph that should haunt every simple reading of his greatness. Let's start with the king. Henry V was 28 years old in October of 1415. He had been on the throne for just over 2 years, inheriting a kingdom from a father, Henry IV, who had seized the crown by deposing and almost certainly murdering his predecessor, Richard II. The House of Lancaster sat on an uneasy throne. Henry V knew that. His entire reign was shadowed by questions of legitimacy that only spectacular success could silence. He was also, in the most direct physical sense, a man who understood war. At the age of 16, at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, a Welsh arrow had struck him in the face. Not a graze, not a flesh wound. The broadhead punched into his cheek at an angle and drove inward toward the back of his skull, where it lodged. For weeks, the wound festered. The royal surgeon, a man named John Bradmore, had to design a custom instrument, a threaded screw device, to work the arrowhead free through the wound channel, without anesthesia, without antibiotics. It took several sessions. Henry survived, and he had known, in his body and his bone, what arrows did to men ever since. France, in 1415, was a kingdom in crisis. King Charles VI was intermittently insane, genuinely, clinically, episodically unable to function. And two rival noble factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, were effectively fighting a civil war for control of the French government. Henry V saw his opening. He had a legal claim to the French throne through his great-great-grandmother, Isabella of France. He decided to press it, not with diplomats, but with 12,000 soldiers and a fleet of ships. The campaign began in August 1415 with the siege of Harfleur, a port town at the mouth of the Seine. The siege took 5 weeks. Harfleur fell, but the delay was catastrophic. Dysentery swept through the English camp with savage efficiency. 1,400 men dead, another 1,400 so sick they had to be shipped home. Henry V now had roughly 9,000 men, already diminished, already weakened. A sensible commander would have wintered at Harfleur and gone home in spring. Henry decided to march to Calais, 260 miles through enemy territory, with a sick and hungry army, in October. It was either the decision of a man who trusted God or a man who trusted himself beyond what any evidence warranted. The French were waiting. The march began on the 8th of October, 1415. Henry expected to reach Calais in 8 days. He had supplies for that. 8 days. The French had other plans. At every river crossing, and in northern France in October there are many, French forces had broken the bridges or were holding the fords in strength. The Somme, which should have taken a day to cross, took 4 additional days of marching upstream to find a crossing point the French hadn't blocked. Those 4 days cost Henry food he didn't have, marching his men harder to make up time, and exposed his entire force to the building French army shadowing them on the other bank. By the 2nd week of marching, the army's rations were effectively exhausted. Men were eating whatever they could forage, raw vegetables from fields, nuts, water from streams of questionable safety. The dysentery that had never fully left the camp flared again. Men who had been marching 17 miles a day were now doing it on empty stomachs, in the rain, in boots that had worn through. The French army, assembled at Rouen and now marching in parallel, was growing every day. Heralds and scouts brought Henry the numbers: 12,000, then 15, then higher. By the time the two armies converged near the village of Agincourt on the 24th of October, the French host numbered somewhere between 15 and 25,000 men. The precise figure doesn't matter as much as what Henry's army could see with their own eyes when the French blocked the road north. A line of enemy soldiers that stretched beyond the visible horizon. Henry had roughly 6,000 men fit to fight. Of those, approximately 5,000 were longbowmen, men from Wales, Cheshire, the Welsh marches, and the English countryside. Paid 6pence a day, not knights, not nobles, farmers' sons and craftsmen's sons who had been required by English law to practice with a longbow from the age of 7. Men who could shoot 12 aimed arrows per minute, whose left arms were visibly more developed than their right from a lifetime of drawing a weapon that required 100 to 160 pounds of force to pull. The remaining men-at-arms, perhaps 900 to 1,500, included the English and Welsh nobility, knights, and their retinues. They would fight on foot. Henry V had ordered them to dismount. He knew that heavy cavalry charging across open ground at prepared archers was a way to spend horses he couldn't afford to lose. The French army had no such economy. They had thousands of mounted knights in full plate armor, the flower of French chivalry, assembled for what they expected to be a straightforward military execution of a sick, starving, retreating English force. There was one more thing. It had rained heavily on the night of the 24th. The field between the two armies, freshly plowed agricultural land, not the hard-packed ground of summer, had been churned into thick, clinging mud overnight. The kind of mud that grabs at boots, that fills gaps in armor, that turns every step into a separate effort of will. The French men-at-arms would have to cross 300 meters of that field in armor weighing between 50 and 65 pounds. The English archers, lightly equipped, had spent part of the morning hammering sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of their positions. A hedge of points angled toward the advancing French cavalry. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1415, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, the two armies faced each other across that muddy ground. The English, sick, starving, outnumbered by at least 3 to 1, possibly more. And Henry V, sitting on a horse at the center of his line, waiting for something to move. The night of October 24th tells you everything you need to know about what was going to happen and why. In the French camp, the mood was festive. This was not braggadocio, it was the natural confidence of men holding every card. The French nobility, dukes, counts, marshals, the greatest titles in the kingdom, debated over wine who would be given the honor of capturing Henry V personally. They argued about it. Who had earned the right to take the English king prisoner? Heralds were already drafting the terms of ransom. One account records that French noblemen were bribing each other for a forward position in the vanguard, not because they wanted to do the hard work of fighting first, but because they wanted to be closest to the glory when it came. In the English camp, there was silence. Henry V walked among his men that night in disguise, a borrowed cloak, his royal insignia hidden, listening. The chronicler of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, a chaplain who was present, records the camp as nearly wordless. Men sat by fires that were kept deliberately small. There was almost nothing to eat. Some men prayed. Some cleaned weapons for the 4th or 5th time. Some simply sat. Henry found men talking quietly about the odds, about their families. One account records a soldier saying that he wished there were more of them, that 10,000 more English soldiers would make him feel better about the morning. It is into this conversation that Henry V, still unrecognized, reportedly said, "I would not wish one more. The fewer men, the greater share of honor." He believed it. That is the thing. He was not performing for morale. He was 30 miles from the coast, cut off, outnumbered, and what he felt was not despair. What he felt, apparently, was clarity. The night passed, the rain fell, and somewhere across the field, French noblemen were still arguing about who got to take him prisoner. Before we get to what happens at dawn, I want you to sit with something for a moment. There are roughly 31,000 men on that field. The vast majority of them, English, French, Welsh, Gascon, did not choose to be there in any meaningful sense. They were there because their king marched, because their lord called, because the law required it, because the alternative was starvation or punishment. Most of them have names we will never know. They are all afraid. The ones who say they aren't are lying. What does it mean to stand anyway? For 3 hours after dawn, Neither side moved. The French had no reason to advance. Every hour that passed worked in their favor. The English were starving, weakening, and had nowhere to go. The French plan, apparently, was simply to wait. Let hunger and desperation do what swords wouldn't need to. Henry could not afford to wait. He had perhaps one day's supplies left. His men were weakening by the hour. And so, at roughly 11 o'clock in the morning, he made a decision that was either tactically brilliant or entirely desperate, or both. He ordered the advance. The entire English army, archers and men-at-arms together, moved forward across the muddy field. 600 yards. They stopped just at the edge of longbow range. The archers drove their sharpened stakes into the ground in front of them, a wall of points angled at the French cavalry. And then Henry V gave the order. The command, "Nestroc," the Welsh battle cry, went down the English line. 6,000 longbows drew simultaneously. The chronicler Jean de Vaurins, who survived the battle, wrote that the arrows came in such numbers that the sky itself seemed to darken. That is almost certainly poetic exaggeration. What is not exaggeration is the sound. The collective snap of 6,000 bowstrings releasing a collective percussion like a single enormous impact. And then, a fraction of a second later, the sound of the arrows arriving, not one by one, but as a mass, a density of iron that struck horses and men simultaneously across the entire width of the French formation. The horses panicked. That was the first thing. The French cavalry was supposed to ride down the English flanks, break the archer formations, and allow the infantry to advance on the dismounted men-at-arms in the center. Instead, hundreds of war horses, struck by arrows, terrified by the noise and mass of the volley, wheeled and bolted. Many of them turned and galloped back directly into the advancing French infantry. The first French formation collapsed inward on itself before it had taken a step. The French vanguard began to advance on foot. It had no choice. 300 meters. In mud. In plate armor. Carrying lances. Think about what that means, physically. A fully armored knight of 14-15 wore between 50 and 65 pounds of steel plate. The weight is not the worst part. The weight is actually distributed reasonably well across a fit body. The worst part is heat, the restriction of movement, and the energy cost of every step in ground that grabs at your feet. The mud at Agincourt was deep and thick. Men described it as knee-deep in places. Every step required wrenching your foot free of suction, replanting, absorbing the weight, wrenching free again. After 50 meters, fit men were breathing hard. After 100, their thighs burned. After 200 meters, the men in the French vanguard were exhausted before they reached the English line. And throughout that entire advance, the arrows never stopped. The English longbowmen could lose approximately 10 to 12 aimed arrows per minute at sustained rates. In the opening minutes of the battle, the arrow density was extraordinary. Arrows punched through visors at close range, through the joints of armor at the shoulder and elbow and knee, through the chainmail underneath plate. Horses that had not bolted were struck and fell, trapping riders beneath them in the mud. The French vanguard, possibly 6,000 men, reached the English men-at-arms after crossing that field. They hit the English line with tremendous force. For a period, the English center buckled. The press of bodies was so intense, the field narrowed by the two flanking woods to perhaps 700 yards, and the French had packed their front so densely with noblemen competing for position that men at the back of the French formation were shoving the men in front of them, and those men could barely lift their arms to fight. They were compressed into a mass that was nearly immobile. The English archers, when they ran out of arrows, or when the press of bodies came close enough, drew short swords, hatchets, mallets. They went into the flanks of the French formation and began killing men who could barely turn to face them. A French knight in full armor, pinned by mud, exhausted from 300 meters of marching, crushed by his own comrades pressing from behind, faced an English archer with a mallet. The archer was wearing a leather jerkin. He could move, he could kneel, he could get low. The knight could not. They were dying on their feet, drowning in mud and plate armor, pressed too tightly to fall. Some men suffocated in the crush. Some drowned in puddles when they fell and couldn't rise. The chroniclers record English boys, walking among the fallen, lifting visors, killing men who couldn't defend themselves. It was not glorious. It was a slaughterhouse. And then came the moment. Approximately 90 minutes into the battle, a report reached Henry V. French forces were attacking the English baggage train in the rear, his supply wagons, his treasury, and, perhaps more critically, the several thousand French prisoners already taken, men who had surrendered, who were disarmed, but who were still alive, still capable of fighting, and who might, in the chaos of a rear attack, be rearmed or simply rise up against their captors. Henry V, surrounded by his household knights, looked at the battlefield. The battle was not yet won. The French reserves had not yet committed. He had 6,000 men and an unknown number of French prisoners mingled among them. He gave the order: kill the prisoners. Thousands of French knights, noble, wealthy, disarmed, bound, were executed where they knelt. The chronicler of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, the anonymous English chaplain who was there, records it as a military necessity, but cannot entirely hide his discomfort. Later French sources are less restrained in their horror. Even by the standards of medieval warfare, even by the chivalric code that governed treatment of noble prisoners, this was a violation. The rear attack turned out to be local peasants and minor troops raiding for baggage. It was not a serious counterattack. The thousands of prisoners were already dead by the time that became clear. When it was over, and it was over quickly, the French second and third formations breaking and fleeing when they saw what had happened to the vanguard, Henry V surveyed the field. French dead, approximately 6,000 to 10,000 men-at-arms and knights. Among them, Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, the Dukes of Alençon, Bar, and Brabant, the Counts of Nevers, Vaudémont, Blamont, Grandpré, and Fauconberg, the flower of French chivalry, dead in the mud of a ploughed field. English dead, approximately 100 to 500 men. Among them, Edward of Norwich, the Duke of York, Henry's cousin, who died at the front of the English line, possibly from heat exhaustion, possibly from wounds. His body so damaged it had to be boiled to extract the bones for transport home. The battle had lasted perhaps 3 hours. Henry V reached Calais 8 days after Agincourt. He returned to England in November 1415 to a reception that contemporary accounts describe as the most spectacular in living memory. London staged celebrations that lasted days. The king was celebrated as a hero touched by God, a warrior king who had done what no English monarch had managed since the Black Prince at Poitiers, and had done it against odds that defied rational explanation. He was not finished. He returned to France in 1417 with a larger, better supplied army and spent 2 years systematically dismantling French resistance. Rouen fell in 1419 after a siege in which Henry, facing a city packed with civilians he could not feed, refused to let refugees leave and stood by while thousands of non-combatants starved in the space between the city walls and his siege lines. Another moral complexity that the legend smooths away. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes made him heir to the French crown. He married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the mad King Charles VI. France and England were to be united under his dynasty. He died on the 31st of August, 1422. He was 35 years old. The cause of death was dysentery, the same disease that had gutted his army at Harfleur, the same disease that had weakened every man who stood in that field at Agincourt. It found Henry V at last, not on a battlefield, but in a bed at the Château de Vincennes, outside Paris, surrounded by his nobles. His son, Henry VI, was 9 months old. Within a generation, the Treaty of Troyes was dead. England, torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict rooted directly in the questionable legitimacy of the House of Lancaster, the very legitimacy Henry V had tried to settle with glory, lost virtually every inch of French territory. By 1453, only Calais remained, the city Henry had been marching toward in October 1415, all of it for Calais. We return then to the cold opens question, not what happened, but what does it mean? Henry V stood when he should have retreated. He fought when he should have surrendered. He won with complete and devastating finality against odds that should have destroyed him. He was also a man who ordered the execution of bound prisoners in the middle of his greatest victory, who let civilians starve in Rouen, who died of a stomach illness before his heir could walk. Was he a great man? Yes, unambiguously. Was he a good man? That question does not have a clean answer. And that is precisely what makes him human, and what makes Agincourt something more than a military curiosity. The greatest victories, it turns out, are not the ones that reveal us at our best. They are the ones that reveal us completely. Agincourt was not a story about longbows or mud or even military genius. It was a story about what men do when every rational argument says stop, and something inside them, something neither entirely noble nor entirely clean, says otherwise. Here is your question to sit with. When you imagine yourself on that field, sick, starving, outnumbered 4 to 1, with nothing between you and the French but a sharpened stake and a draw weight your shoulders have known since childhood, do you stand or do you run? And the harder question, do you know the answer or do you only hope you do? If this story moved you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Hit subscribe if you want more history told the way it actually happened. Brutal, complicated, and worth your time. Drop a comment. I read them all, and I want to know what you think Henry V's order to kill the prisoners says about him. This has been the ancient warfare. Some fields remember what was done on them longer than the men who did it. And I will see you in the next one.